All right, guys, today's lecture is going to be about chapter 20.3. Climate and nutrient availability are the primary controls on net primary productivity and terrestrial ecosystems, which is word soup. But what it's saying is that basically the climate of a region and how many nutrients are available to a primary producer, or we could say autotroph. We're talking about plants here. Um, those are going to be what control primary productivity. So remember, primary productivity for us is basically photosynthesis. It could also be from chemoautotrophy, but we're not talking about that right now. We're not worried about that. And I'm definitely not wearing pajama pants, by the way. So the questions we're going to be answering are: what effect do environmental factors have on net primary productivity in terrestrial ecosystems? Spoiler alert, things need water, things need light, things need nutrients. How is solar radiation related to mean annual temperature? This is a topic we discussed a long time ago, what feels like years and years ago, but was actually just January. How are the effects of temperature and precipitation on primary productivity related? And how does net primary productivity vary across different ecosystems? So some things to keep in the back of your head as we're going through. So lots of things can influence primary productivity, and it should be obvious, hopefully, that primary productivity increases with annual precipitation. So if you guys remember the equation for photosynthesis, it's like CO2 and H2O in the presence of light produce sugar, right? Well, if you don't have one of those components, if you don't have water, which you get from precipitation, you're not going to be able to photosynthesize. So here is a nice graph that shows you there's this very strong correlation between precipitation and your net primary productivity. Okay, so the more rain you have in a region, the more photosynthesis or more primary productivity you have in a region. So net primary productivity increases with mean annual temperature. Why do you suppose this is? Well, generally, the higher your annual temperature, the more solar radiation you're going to have. Okay, so the more sunlight you have, the higher temperature you're going to have. And remember, again, that equation for photosynthesis, you need to have sunlight in order for primary productivity to even happen. So here's a nice correlation between temperature and net primary productivity. Um, Areas that have higher temperatures also have longer growing seasons because of the way sort of the equator is. You see all the higher temperature regions tend to be around the equator, and those have the longest growing seasons. Okay, so the number of days with temperatures that are warm enough to support photosynthesis, if you have more of those, you're going to have more photosynthesis. You're going to have more primary productivity. And here is a little map, not a map. This is a graph that shows you different regions that have different numbers of photosynthetic periods related to net primary productivity. Okay, the reason that there's lots of variation within this graph is that it can get too hot in certain regions for photosynthesis to functionally be able to happen. So there are lots of photosynthetic days in deserts, but it's going to be too hot for a lot of plants to exist there. Certainly plants do exist there, CAM plants, C4 plants, which we talked about, but it's going to be harder for them to exist there. So how does the interaction between mean annual precipitation and temperature affect net primary productivity? How do plants lose water? How do plants gain water? And remember, plants are principally losing water through evapotranspiration, or just transpiration. Remember, they have those stomata that are closed if it's dry, and then those stomata open up. Stomata open up if it is wet. Okay, so think about be thinking about temperature and water here. So again, we're going back to that equation, and again, I'm sorry, this is too much text, but photosynthesis, you need carbon dioxide and water. Stomata open to bring in carbon dioxide, but when those stomata open up, they're actually losing water through transpiration, right? That's why plants close stomata at night, depending on what kind of plant they are. Water is brought up through the roots, and more precipitation, more rainfall means that more water is available. Okay, so the amount of water available limits the rate of photosynthesis, limits the number of leaves that can be supported. So if you guys remember, that's a trade-off. Um, if there isn't a lot of water, plants grow their root system larger. So there's not a lot of water, plants are growing their root system larger, which means they have less energy to devote to leaf production. Okay, and that is going to influence primary productivity. Warm air temperatures increase transpiration, so more water is being lost. And if water availability is low, net primary productivity will be low because again, they cannot photosynthesize. If air temperatures are cool, net primary productivity will be low regardless of water availability. Why is that, do you think? Why would having cool temperatures and a lot of water mean that you can't have a lot of net primary productivity? Well, think about places like Alaska. Okay, there's lots of water there. It's covered with water actually, but all of the water is frozen. Okay, so net primary productivity can't really be high in those areas because the temperatures are so low. Um, so if you have a similar mean temperature though, low rainfall, like let's say you had a region that was an average of 60 degrees year round and you had low rainfall versus an area that was 60 degrees year round and you had high rainfall, one of those regions is going to have low productivity, one of them is going to have high productivity. I'll let you guys think about which one that would be. Warm temperatures and enough water give you the highest net primary productivity in general. And there's this concept called actual evapotranspiration, or AET, and it is combining evaporation and transpiration. So precipitation brings water in, incoming radiation and temperature demand water. Weird way of phrasing it, but incoming radiation and temperature are going to cause water to evaporate off, regardless of how much is precipitated. So this shows you, this is above ground productivity because it's the easiest it's easiest to measure as opposed to going after roots in some of these areas. And you can see the higher the actual evapotranspiration is, the higher the productivity is. It's kind of an odd graph, but I mean, you can imagine in a tropical forest, there's so much precipitation that it doesn't necessarily matter how much is evapotranspirated. And the more leaves you have, actually physically, the more leaves you have, the more you are going to transpire that water. So global patterns reflect the influence on climate and net primary productivity. Where are the zones of highest net primary productivity, and what happens as latitude increases or as you go higher or lower from the equator? So let's think about this for a second. Where do you think the highest net primary productivity is? Based on, you want warm temperatures, generally not super high, but you want warm temperatures so that not all the water is frozen, all the water is available, and you want high precipitation. So you can see here, like the bluer things are, the more productivity you have. The highest regions are in this tropical region here, and then you have some high regions in these subtropical regions here and here. But here's the Amazon rainforest. Obviously, this is a huge region of productivity. Here's rainforests in Africa. Here is New Zealand, Malaysia, Indonesia, rainforests. There's going to be a ton of rainforest there. Those are the regions that have the highest productivity. The availability of essential plant nutrients also affects productivity. Remember, plants are getting their carbon source from the atmosphere, but they're getting nutrients from the ground. And the general pattern is that net primary productivity increases with increasing soil nutrient availability. So in Wisconsin, they looked at different soil nitrogen concentrations, and they saw that there was an increase in productivity as you increase nitrogen concentration. I believe they looked at just different oak forests, and they looked at the differences in the soil availability of nitrogen. So you see primary productivity is increasing in general with increasing nitrogen availability. And again, this is just rehashing that study. Oak savannas on the transition from eastern forest to western grasslands in North America. They examined 20 mature savanna stands, and they showed that as soil nitrogen availability increases, net primary productivity increases, which should make some sense. The more nutrients you have available to you, the more productive you're going to be. Different study, but yeah. There you have it. I actually confused the studies, but they're saying the same thing. As you have more nitrogen, you're going to have more primary productivity. If you have more nitrogen, you have more productivity. So the next section we're going to be talking about is 20.4, which is light and nutrient availability are the primary controls on net primary productivity in aquatic ecosystems. So we were just talking about terrestrial, then we're going to talk about aquatic. And we'll get to that. I'll start those questions in the next lecture.